Hello, everyone. In my paper, I am addressing the narratives in Georgia about Russia, as you just mentioned, and how pro-Russia labeling of political opponents function in Georgia, first under United National Movement government from 2003 to 2012, and then since 2012 under the Georgian Dream leadership. Here I'm going through the dozens of statements and narratives and remarks of both the ruling parties as well as, to some degree, the opposition. In the beginning, I should mention that this paper is a rather short paper, which cannot really cover every major aspect or the discourse on Russia, which is taking place in Georgia. Especially this paper is not dealing with the discourses in the church, for instance, or media, but this is rather more focused on what the key political players in the country. In my paper, I'm addressing two questions, basically. So when does Russian factor resurface in Georgian political discourse, and why Georgian political actors are using and abusing, so to say, pro-Russia labeling against their opponents? I mean, before moving to actual part, I mean, something that should be taken into account is that but basically every major research shows in Georgia that Russia is perceived as a major external threat to Georgia, which has been meddling in Georgian affairs, I mean, at least since 90s and well even before, especially since 2008 August war over South Ossetia, Civil.ge region. The Russia's image in Georgia has been really strengthened as aggressor, main aggressor. But the large part of the Georgian population sees Russia as a threat, and even most Russia-friendly actors in Georgia too cannot deny that there is a problem of Russian occupation of Georgian regions. So this is the starting point on which Georgian politicians are then capitalizing. In my paper, I argue that Georgian ruling elites, as well as the opposition, tend to respond to internal challenges and discontent, domestic discontent with the pro-Russia labeling against their opponents, and they are sometimes ridiculously using the same kind of labels against one another. And so, with Russia serving as a chief, so to say, adversary or enemy in Georgian mind, the Georgian politicians and parties blame each other of being Kremlin stooges and agents of Kremlin, while presenting themselves as the defenders of the patriotic cause. And the labeling is activated amidst political crisis, and also what my research showed, for electoral purposes, basically to mobilize their voter base and to discredit opponents amid election process. Now, the discourses about Russia and the pro-Russia discourse about Russia is not really it doesn't really have this continuity. It has changed over the course of the years under the national movement government, and also under the Georgian Dream. Under the United National Movement government, for instance, Mikhail Saakashvili, when he was inaugurated in 2004 January, he offered this hand of partnership to Russia. So in the beginning, there seemed to be constructive relations with Russia. But then many divergent issues on the conflict regions, also Georgia's integration and quest to integrate into NATO, contributed to tensions between the two countries. I also recall attention. I mean, I'm also recalling in this paper 2006 Pyro, which happened right before the local elections, which helped United National Movement to boost its popular support, aiming growing challenges, internal challenges towards its government. And also 2007 November demonstrations really showcased how Russian factories used in Georgia. So in November 7, 2007, protest disastrous handling by the government was by authorities justified by the fact that arguing that Russia stood behind the attempted coup to topple down Saakashvili's government. So this was an attempt to justify violence against protesters. And on that day, Georgian police even accused several Georgian politicians, including some well-known pro-Western politicians, of cooperating with Russian special services. This as an evidence, it was presented that they talked to some Russian diplomat in Tbilisi. So the point here is that, of course, in Georgia, there are plenty of pro-Russian actors, but the thing is that usually the accusations are taking place without providing much evidence, and without basically it is not done by the relevant agencies that should be dealing with exposing any external challenges, but by the political party leaderships that are usually scaremongering about about their opponents being Russian stooges. And this under the United National Movement in late years, it was more visible that Saakashvili, for instance, the ex-president, tried to portray Russia as a backward country, as opposed to Georgia being a reformer country. And he said Georgia was Russia's chief rival in the sphere of ideology because Georgia had this many reforms. And this served also in a way to boost the image of the country, and by doing so, boost the image of Saakashvili and his party as well. This pro-Russia labeling under the United National Movement was more intensified when Bidzina Ivanishvili, who made fortune in Russia in '90s, entered into Georgian politics. So Saakashvili, for instance, would say that no matter how Moscow would dream of restoring Soviet Union and incorporate Georgia, it would not take place. But even during the UNM's tenure, it was not just the ruling party, but also the opposition accusing ruling party of being financed from Moscow. And for instance, Labour Party leader would say that Saakashvili was afraid that he would be toppled down, as he toppled down Shevardnadze, for instance, his predecessor, by the help of US and Russian special services. So these accusations have been actually going against one another from both from the UNM to opposition, and the opposition also was retaliating with similar accusations and narratives and labeling. Well, moving to the Georgian Dreams, Georgians in tenure, initially Ivanishvili's government tried to somehow tone down with Russia rhetoric, and in the beginning it seemed to be cooperative. But then something that was notorious here was that important to note is that they were not just merely accepting being labeled as pro-Russians, but they were somehow retaliating and creating counter narratives against the UNM. For instance, the GD's key point was that Saakashvili was irritating Russia with, for instance, integration into NATO, and these led to Russia pursuing this policy of invading Georgia and ending up occupying the two territories. So they were blaming UNM of deteriorating relations with Russia. So not necessarily, so somehow shifting the blame from Russia more towards the United National Movement to basically discredit the opponents. This was the major aim. But over the course of the years, despite the fact that Georgian products went to the Russian market and the number of Russian tourists increased and bilateral ties increased, like people-to-people contacts mostly, the key issues that Georgian Dreams promised to solve with having friends, so to say, normalized relations with Russia were unaddressed and were not solved. Like this is the occupation of the Abkhazian Tskhin Valley region, as well as Georgia's integration to NATO. And the public's approval of Georgian Dream's Russian policy plummeted all these years. And this somehow, well, as Sonia mentioned, correlation is not causation and the opposite necessarily, but then it somewhat coincided to this 2018 presidential elections and 2019 June unrest against the visit of Russian lawmakers in the Georgian parliament. And in 2018, what we've seen was that Georgian Dream and the pro-government media used this pro-Russia labeling more or less like for the first time, this vividly against UNM. So they started to blame UNM in something that they were blamed themselves and accused of by the United National Movement. For instance, in 2018, you may recall, President Zurabishvili stirred some controversy with remarks about the August War. So she was accused of being pro-Kremlin and being pro-Russia, like because he said Saakashvili was provoked into the war and assaulted its population in Civil.ge region, etc. And then the pro-government media, because President Zurabishvili's candidacy was backed by the Georgian Dream ruling party, even though she was nominally independent, pro-government media then tried to discredit Mr. Vashadze, who was UNM's candidate in presidential elections and chief rival for Zurabishvili, that he was Soviet-era diplomat, he was educated in Moscow, and look, now we have French-born Georgian educated in the West, as opposed to UNM's guy who is who was educated in Russia, etc. So this was the first time in the Georgian Dream's discursive change about Russia, which was better manifested after June 20, 2019 unrest in Tbilisi, with the so-called Gavril of Night and the disastrous handling of this protest by the police. Then again, opposition activated this discourse that the Georgian Dream was pursuing Kremlin's policy, inviting Russian politicians here in Georgia, etc. and etc. Especially former Prime Minister Kakharya, who served as Interior Minister at that time, has served as the major Russian stooge in the eyes of the opposition. But interestingly here, the thing is that the Georgian Dream leadership then also started to, so to say, retaliate with similar narratives and pro-Russia labeling against the opposition, and accusing them of, so to say, that they were cooperating with Russians because they wanted to discredit the Georgian Dream. When I actually began working on this paper, I think in spring, in March, we had this incident with Russian journalist Mr. Posner visiting Georgia, and there was huge outcry against his visit because of some of his controversial remarks about Abkhazia. Again, the opposition started to talk how Georgian Dream is pursuing pro-Russia policy, for instance. But then interestingly, the ruling party chair, Mr. Otar Kobakhidze, said, accused, for instance, Elena Khoshtaria, who first broke the story about Posner's visit, that she's a Kremlin's agent. Why, in other case, why would she know that Mr. Posner was visiting Georgia, for instance? This was the argument. So and now the Georgian Dream also is using this pro-Russia labeling against the opposition. And even though the current party in power has all the power to investigate any of this, they are not actually investigating if there is someone spying for Russia, for instance, or doing any pro-Russian job. But this is not really evidence-based, but serving only to discredit political opponents. this sort of labeling is the result of this tense political environment, but it also breeds this extreme political polarization, because Georgian political actors are not really treating each other as just rivals, but as being but of others being basically the tools at the hand of the foreign adversary. So this creates the environment where political parties are pursuing sort of a battle of life and death in a way, which leaves no room for discussion, which leaves no room for discussing many actual pressing issues, economic or social. And unfortunately, this is something that actually hinders Georgia's democratic development and discredits the country in the eyes of its international partners, because it doesn't allow the country to move to a normal path of development. But we are experiencing this number of crises over the last 2 years and a half, and this labeling accusations that are running in both ways also contributes to this extreme political polarization. And unfortunately, and this is my last point. I mean, we should not perhaps expect anytime soon that this political discourse will change in the country, because the key players, that is the Georgian Dream and the United National Movement, are benefiting from this political polarization in the country, which translates into electoral successes for them. So it will be hard for Georgian political spectrum to end this hostile and negative rhetoric, which is often not based on facts but used as attempts to discredit opponents. Thank you.